Have you ever closed your eyes not to sleep, not to escape, but in seen someone standing there who you haven't met yet? Not a dream, not a fantasy, something quieter than that, something that felt like a memory you hadn't lived yet. I have, and I remember the exact moment it happened. I wasn't searching for her. I wasn't thinking about love. I was deep inside the machinery of ambition, deadlines, missions, systems, and then without warning, like a reflection appearing in a mirror I didn't know was there, I saw her, standing beside me. Not in front of me, not behind me, beside me. That one vision changed how I understood everything. Purpose, partnership, the strange, terrifying, beautiful way the universe speaks to people who have finally learned to go quiet enough to listen. I had to share this, because I think you felt something like it too, and nobody ever told you it was real. This is about that. I want to tell you something I've never been entirely comfortable saying out loud. Not because it embarrasses me, but because the moment you say something like this, people reach for categories. They call it mysticism. They call it wishful thinking. They call it delusion, dressed up in beautiful language. And I've learned, slowly, sometimes painfully, that the most real things in a human life are precisely the ones that resist being categorized. So I'll ask you to do one thing before we go any further. Set down whatever framework you've been using to understand love. Just for now. Just for the length of this conversation. Because what I want to share with you doesn't live inside a framework. It lives in the space between what you know and what you feel. In that quiet corridor where logic runs out of hallway and something deeper takes over. I believe in systems. I believe in engineering. I believe that almost every problem, when broken down with enough precision and enough patience, reveals a solution hiding inside it. That's how I've moved through most of my life. Dissect the complexity, find the mechanism, build toward the outcome. And for a long time, I tried to apply that same architecture to understanding myself. But here's what nobody told me. The inner life doesn't yield to blueprints. The soul, whatever you want to call it, whatever language sits comfortably with you, doesn't submit to the same logic you use to solve systems. And love, real love, the kind that reshapes the person you thought you were, that follows a completely different set of rules. It doesn't announce itself in data. It doesn't send you a notification. It arrives the way dawn arrives. Not all at once, not with a press release. Just quietly, gradually, then undeniably present. Have you ever felt that? That something was arriving long before you could name it. I had been living at full velocity for so long that stillness felt like malfunction. Every hour was accounted for. Every variable was tracked. I had trained myself to interpret silence as inefficiency, as wasted bandwidth. So when the vision came, I almost missed it. Not because it was small, because I wasn't listening. It happened in a moment of unusual quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from the absence of noise, it comes from the absence of urgency. And in that stillness, like a reflection appearing in a mirror I hadn't known was there, I saw her. Not her face, not her features, not the specific shape of her, but her presence. The way she stood beside me, the way the space between us felt inhabited, not empty. She wasn't filling a gap. She was completing a geometry I hadn't known was incomplete. And I remember thinking, not in words, but in some language deeper than words, I know you. I don't know your name yet, but I know you. This is the part where people get uncomfortable. I understand that. Because we've been taught, collectively, culturally, loudly, that love is something you build. You meet someone, you assess compatibility, you negotiate values, you decide, you architect it piece by piece from the raw material of two separate lives. And that is real. That process is real and necessary and worthy. I'm not dismissing any of it. But what I'm telling you is that before all of that, before the meeting, before the assessment, before the negotiation, there is sometimes a knowing, a recognition, a vision that arrives not as fantasy, but as something that feels more like memory than imagination. As if the future reached backward through time, tapped you on the shoulder and said, pay attention, because what's coming is important. Psychology calls it intuition. Philosophers call it perception beyond ordinary sense. Spiritual traditions across every culture call it by different names. Some say it is God, some say it is the universe, some say it is the deepest layer of the self, whispering what the noise of daily life has been drowning out. I don't need to settle on a single word for it. I just know what it felt like, and it felt true. More true than most things I've known. But here's the emotional turn, and stay with me here. The vision didn't make me feel certain. It made me feel responsible. That's the part no one talks about. We romanticize the vision. We celebrate the sign. We post about divine timing and destiny and the universe's plan. But nobody tells you that when something reveals itself to you, truly reveals itself, the immediate feeling isn't euphoria. It's weight. It's the quiet, humbling, almost terrifying awareness that you have been shown something precious. And now you have to become someone worthy of it. Have you ever been given a gift so significant it frightened you? That's what this felt like. Not a dream to chase, a standard to meet. Because the woman I saw in that vision, that presence standing steady and luminous beside me, she wasn't looking for someone to complete her. She was whole. She was already whole. And what she seemed to require, what the vision communicated without speaking a single word, was a man who was equally whole. Not perfect, not finished, but honest about his incompleteness in a way that didn't make it someone else's burden to carry. That realization broke something open in me. Because up until that point, I had been approaching life, and quietly, unconsciously, love as another domain of performance. Another arena where you demonstrate capability, where you prove you are worth selecting. And the vision said, no. That's not how this works. The right person doesn't need your performance. She needs your presence. She doesn't need your credentials. She needs your truth. And I wasn't sure, in that moment, that I knew how to give that. The inner voice, and this matters, so listen carefully. The inner voice is not always comfortable. We misunderstand intuition. We think it comes to us like a reassurance, like a warm hand on the shoulder telling us everything will be fine. Sometimes it does. But sometimes intuition arrives as a challenge. It shows you what is possible, and then it shows you the gap between where you are and where you need to be. It doesn't do this to punish you. It does this because it believes in you. Because the part of you that exists beyond fear and ego and conditioning, that part knows what you're capable of. And it refuses to let you settle for less. That voice, that vision, that reflection in a mirror I didn't know was there. It wasn't just showing me her. It was showing me who I needed to become to deserve her. And that right there is where the real work begins. Not in the searching, not in the hoping, but in the becoming. In the slow, deliberate, sometimes exhausting, always expanding process of growing into the person your deepest self already knows you can be. That is not a romantic idea. That is a psychological truth. The relationships that last, the ones that carry real weight and real warmth, they don't survive because two people got lucky. They survive because two people were willing, again and again, to choose growth over comfort, honesty over appearance, presence over performance. The vision gave me direction, but the direction pointed inward first. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think you already know what I'm talking about. I think somewhere inside you, past the noise and the strategy and the careful management of how you present yourself to the world, there is a voice. There is a knowing. There is something that's been trying to tell you, quietly, persistently, without drama, this is who you are. This is what you're capable of. This is what real love looks like for you. The only question is whether you're willing to go quiet enough to hear it. I was, eventually, and it changed everything. There is a particular kind of courage that nobody puts on a resume, nobody frames it on a wall, nobody builds a monument to it. And yet it may be the most demanding form of bravery a human being can practice. It is the courage to trust what you cannot prove, to act on what you feel before you can explain it, to follow a signal that has no frequency you can measure, and no source you can point to on any map. That kind of courage doesn't roar, it whispers. And the tragedy is that most people, in the noise of their very busy and very logical lives, mistake that whisper for weakness. I almost made that mistake. I want to talk to you about signs, not in the way that word gets used lightly, not as superstition, not as coincidence dressed in costume, not as the desperate pattern recognition of someone who wants something to be true. I mean something more honest than that. I mean the quiet accumulation of moments that individually seem unremarkable. But when you step back and see them together, they form something unmistakable. A direction, a convergence, a message that was always being sent, but only becomes readable when you've grown patient enough to stop filling every silence with your own noise. Because here's what I've come to understand about signs. They don't shout, they calibrate. They show up in the margins of your day, in the conversation you weren't expecting that left you thinking for 3 days afterward, in the book that fell open to exactly the page you needed, in the moment of stillness between two large decisions where something small and true passed through you like a current. Signs are not magic. They are not superstition. They are the universe's way of confirming a direction your inner self already knew, and your conscious mind was too proud, too busy, or too afraid to admit. And the one sign I kept encountering in the weeks and months after that vision was this. Every time I moved toward building something real, something genuine, something that required me to be vulnerable rather than impressive, the path clarified. And every time I moved toward performance, toward presentation, toward the version of myself I had carefully constructed for the world's approval, the path clouded. Something in me resisted. Something said, not this way, not anymore. Have you ever felt that resistance, that quiet but persistent friction, when you're moving in the wrong direction? Most people interpret that friction as doubt. They push harder, they apply more effort, more strategy, more polish to whatever they're building. They assume the resistance is the obstacle to overcome. But I've learned, and this learning cost me some things I'd rather not have lost, that not all resistance is obstacle. Some resistance is instruction. Some friction is the soul applying the brakes before you drive something beautiful off a cliff. The sign I kept missing was the one pointing inward. And that's when everything I believed about how love works began to fall apart. I had a model, I think most of us do, even if we never articulate it. A mental architecture for how the right relationship would arrive and what it would look like and how we would know. Mine was built, like most of my mental architecture, around evidence, around demonstration. I believed that love was something you recognized because it checked the boxes. Compatible values, intellectual alignment, shared direction. And those things matter. I want to be clear about that. Those things genuinely matter. But I was using them as a wall, as much as I was using them as a compass. I was hiding behind the checklist because the checklist never asked me to be afraid. It never asked me to be soft. It never asked me to sit in the middle of my own uncertainty and simply feel. And then the signs started arriving in the form of people. Not her, not yet, but people who showed me, in quiet and consistent ways, what presence actually looks like, what it means to be genuinely seen by another human being. Not impressed, not assessed, seen. I would sit across from someone who listened, really listened, not waiting for their turn to speak, but actually absorbing what I was offering. And I would feel something shift inside me, something low and quiet, like a frequency I hadn't known was missing, suddenly returning to the signal. That is a sign. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind you put in a story to make people gasp. But real. Quietly, undeniably real. Wait, before you move past this moment, hear what I'm actually saying. The signs that matter most in a life are rarely the spectacular ones. They're the ones that make you feel like yourself again. The conversation that reminds you what you actually believe. The moment of silence with someone that doesn't feel empty, it feels full. The small, unremarkable instance where you catch yourself not performing and realize you're still likable, still worthy, still enough. These are signs. These are the universe's curriculum, and they're specifically designed for you, not for the person you're pretending to be, for the actual you, underneath everything. The reason most people miss them is not stupidity. It's speed. We move too fast. We fill the space between moments with content, with noise, with the comfortable numbness of constant stimulation. And the signs, which operate at the frequency of stillness, simply can't compete. They're not trying to compete. They have too much dignity for that. They just wait, patiently, as long as it takes, for the moment you finally go quiet enough to notice them. I had to teach myself stillness. And I want to be honest with you, that was harder for me than almost anything else I've ever built. Because stillness felt, for a long time, like surrender, like conceding ground to the chaos. I was wrong. Stillness is not surrender. Stillness is reconnaissance. It is the act of listening so deeply to what is real that when the moment arrives, when she arrives, when the right thing arrives, you are not scrambling to recognize it. You already know. Here is the psychological truth underneath all of this. The human nervous system is extraordinarily sophisticated. Beneath the layer of conscious thought, beneath the opinions and the logic and the carefully maintained self-image, there is a processing system of breathtaking depth. It reads micro-expressions, it registers emotional frequencies, it detects congruence and incongruence between what someone says and what they mean. It has been doing this your entire life. And when it detects something real, when it encounters a person, a moment, a direction that aligns with your deepest architecture, it sends a signal. Not as a thought, as a feeling. As a quiet, full-bodied sense of recognition that something important is happening. We call that intuition. But it is not mysticism. It is sophisticated processing wearing a spiritual coat. And that signal, that recognition, that is a sign, the most important kind. But here's the part that truly changed me. I realized that my ability to receive signs, to trust them, to act on them, was directly proportional to my relationship with myself. Not my relationship with achievement. Not my relationship with success or output, or the external measures I had spent years accumulating. My relationship with myself. My willingness to sit alone with who I actually was, stripped of everything impressive, and find that person worthy of being listened to. Because you cannot trust the inner voice if you've spent years teaching yourself to distrust the inner self. You cannot read the signs the universe sends if you've constructed a version of yourself so polished and so performative that the real you can't even find a way through. The signs speak to your truth. They are in conversation with your core. And if your core is buried under 15 layers of strategy and self-protection, the message never arrives. Don't pretend you haven't felt that disconnection. That gap between who you are and who you've been presenting. That exhaustion that comes not from working too hard, but from maintaining a version of yourself that doesn't quite fit. That hollow satisfaction when you achieve something that looked correct from the outside, but felt oddly quiet on the inside. That gap is the sign, the largest one of all. It is pointing you back toward something, back toward yourself, back toward the truth of what you need and who you are and what kind of love is actually meant for you. Not what looks good, not what impresses people, not what fits the model you inherited from someone else's definition of a successful life. The reflection in the mirror only shows you what's actually there. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't deceive. It just shows you, clearly, precisely, without embellishment, the truth of what is standing before it. And you have to be brave enough to look. I want to ask you something honest. When you imagine the life you were meant to live, not the life you planned, not the life that made sense on paper, not the version you rehearsed when someone asked you about your 5-year goals, but the real one, the one that lives in the quiet part of you that you rarely show anyone. What does it feel like? Not look like. Feel like. Because I've noticed something. Most people have a very detailed visual map of the life they want. The house, the achievement, the relationship that photographs well. And very few people have an emotional map, a felt sense of what that life is supposed to be inside, what it's supposed to feel like to wake up inside it, whether it carries warmth or purpose, or the specific kind of peace that only comes when you are fully and finally in alignment with who you actually are. That distinction between the visual map and the emotional map is everything. And love, I've come to understand, does not live on the visual map. It lives on the emotional one. I want to tell you about emotional destiny. Not as a mystical concept, not as a cosmic guarantee that the universe owes you a soulmate, but as something precise and psychological and deeply, practically real. Emotional destiny is the idea that each of us carries, somewhere below the level of conscious decision-making, a blueprint, not of the specific person we are meant to meet, but of the emotional experience we are meant to have, the quality of connection we are wired for, the depth of trust, the specific texture of belonging, the particular way another person's presence is supposed to feel in the architecture of our life. That blueprint was written long before you were old enough to date anyone. It was written in the first relationships you ever witnessed. In the first time someone made you feel safe, or didn't. In the moments of childhood warmth or childhood absence that carved grooves into your understanding of what love is and what it does. This isn't therapy language for the sake of it. This is the foundational psychology of every adult relationship you will ever have. You are always, at some level, navigating toward or away from that original emotional blueprint. And here is where it gets profound. The vision I had, that reflection appearing in a mirror I hadn't known was there, it wasn't showing me a fantasy. It was showing me the emotional blueprint. It was showing me what genuine companionship actually feels like in the body. Not what it looks like, what it feels like. And the reason it hit me with such force, the reason it settled somewhere deep and didn't float away like a daydream, was because it matched something I already carried, something true and foundational, something that said, this is what you've always been moving toward, even when you didn't know it. Have you ever recognized something you'd never seen before? That paradox, recognition without prior experience, is one of the most disorienting and beautiful things the human heart is capable of. And it only happens when you've done enough inner work to know what you actually need, as distinct from what you've been told to want. That work is not soft work. That work is some of the most demanding excavation a person can undertake. Because what you find underneath the conditioning, underneath the performance, underneath the accumulated opinions of everyone who ever had authority over your self-image, is something surprisingly simple, something that doesn't need much explaining. It just needs acknowledgement. But here's what nobody told me about emotional destiny. It does not wait for you to be ready. It arrives on its own schedule, in its own form, with its own quiet authority. And if you are not paying attention, if you are too buried in the noise of achievement or the comfort of numbness, it will pass through your life like a current through water you didn't know you were swimming in. You'll feel it afterward, that sense that something important was nearby and you weren't present enough to reach for it. I felt that. The missed current. The moment of recognition that came a fraction too late. And I want to tell you, it is one of the most clarifying forms of pain I know. Not because the loss is permanent, but because it is instructive. Because it teaches you, with more authority than any book ever could, exactly what you were not paying attention to. Exactly where you were sleepwalking in your own life. And the lesson is always the same. Be present. Be honest. Be available to what is real. Now I want to go deeper into something that I believe is at the core of every meaningful relationship, and is almost never discussed in those terms. It is the concept of emotional congruence. The alignment between what a person presents on the outside and what they carry on the inside. Between the face they show the world and the self that exists when no one is looking. Most of us, by the time we are adults, have built some degree of gap between those two things. Some gap is natural. We all contain multitudes. We all have private dimensions. We all hold certain parts of ourselves back until trust is established. That is not deception. That is wisdom. But when the gap becomes a chasm, when the person you present to the world bears almost no resemblance to the person you are, when the lights go down and the performance ends, then you have a problem. Not a moral problem, a relational one. Because the right person, the one that matches your emotional blueprint, the one the vision was pointing toward, she cannot fall in love with the performance. She will sense the gap. Not intellectually, not with evidence she could articulate in an argument, but in her body, in the quiet discomfort of feeling close to someone who somehow remains unreachable, in the persistent sense that she is touching a surface and wondering what lives below it. Look at me when I say this. The deepest love you will ever experience cannot coexist with a false version of yourself. It is not possible. Not because love is fragile, real love is not fragile. It is one of the most resilient forces I know. But because real love requires a real person to love. It requires access. It requires the permission to come past the lobby and into the actual rooms where you actually live. And if those rooms are locked, if you've spent years convincing yourself that the lobby is good enough, that the well-lit entrance with its impressive furnishings is all that needs to be shown, then love will stand at the door, knock once or twice with patience and grace, and eventually walk away. Not because you weren't worth loving, but because you didn't believe you were. That is the psychological root of almost every relationship that started with promise and ended in distance. Not incompatibility, not timing, not the circumstances that make such convenient excuses, but one or both people unable to believe, at the level where belief actually operates, below the thought, below the language, below the rational mind, that they were worth being fully known. And I want to challenge you on that. Right now, in this moment, wherever you are, I want to ask you, do you believe you are worth being fully known? Not your achievements, not your strengths, not the parts of yourself you've curated for public consumption, but the entire person, the doubts and the tenderness and the private fears and the dreams you haven't told anyone because you're not sure they'll survive being spoken out loud. Do you believe that person deserves to be loved? Because the answer to that question is the foundation of everything. Not charm, not strategy, not timing, not even chemistry. The foundational question of every meaningful relationship is simply, do I believe I am worth being known? And the extraordinary thing, the thing that fills me with something I can only describe as quiet awe, is that the moment you answer yes to that question, the moment you stop managing your own access and start offering your actual self to the world, something shifts. Not just in your relationships, in your entire reality. The vision you saw, the emotional blueprint you carry, the destiny that has been patiently waiting for you to show up as yourself, it starts to come into focus. Not because the universe rewarded your vulnerability, but because you finally became visible, not just to others, to yourself. And that, I've learned, is where every real love story actually begins. Not with a meeting, not with attraction, not with the perfect moment, in the perfect setting, with the perfect version of yourself on display. It begins with the quiet, private, profoundly brave decision to stop hiding from your own reflection. The mirror doesn't show you the future. It shows you the truth of now. And the truth of now is always exactly what you need to see. I want to talk about trust. Not the word, not the concept as it gets thrown around in self-help conversations and relationship podcasts. I want to talk about what trust actually is, when you strip away the language and get down to the raw mechanics of it. Because I think most of us have been operating on a fundamentally broken definition. And that broken definition has quietly sabotaged some of the most important things we've ever tried to build. Here's the definition I grew up with, the one most of us absorbed without choosing trust, is what you feel when someone has proven themselves. It is the earned result of consistent evidence. It is confidence built on a track record. And within that model, trust is always reactive. It always comes after the proof, after the demonstration, after the accumulation of enough data points to justify the opening of the gate. That model is not wrong. In certain contexts, it is wise. You do not hand the keys of something precious to someone who has given you no reason to believe they'll treat it carefully. I understand that. I respect that. But here's what that model completely fails to account for. There's a category of trust that must come before the evidence. A trust that operates not as a response to proof, but as a precondition for it. A trust that you extend, consciously, vulnerably, with full awareness of the risk, into the space where proof does not yet exist, where the data is insufficient, where you are standing at the edge of something real, and the only way to know if it will hold your weight is to step onto it. That kind of trust is not a feeling, it is a decision, made in the dark, without guarantee, without the safety net of certainty. And it is, without any question, one of the hardest things a human being can do. Have you ever stood at that edge, that precise, terrifying moment where the feeling is real and the risk is real, and the only way forward is the one that requires you to release control? I have stood there, more than once, and I want to tell you honestly, the first several times I backed away, not out of cowardice, or at least not only that, but because I had built so much of my self-conception around competence, around knowing, around moving through the world with enough intelligence and foresight to minimize surprise. And trust, real trust, the kind that love requires, is the deliberate acceptance of surprise. It is the willingness to say, I cannot control what happens next. I cannot optimize this. I cannot engineer a guaranteed outcome. And I am choosing to move forward anyway. For someone who has spent his life turning unknowns into knowns, that is not a small thing to ask. But here's the emotional turn, the one I didn't see coming. The moment I began to extend that kind of trust, not blindly, not recklessly, but consciously, with eyes open and heart steady, I discovered something extraordinary. Trust is not just a gift you give to another person. It is a gift you give to yourself. Because the act of trusting,